Oh boy, it's finally time for Ace Combat Assault Horizon, the undisputed black sheep of the Ace Combat franchise. For those of you that might not have been around, modern military shooters were the gaming craze from 2007 to about 2016, and this is mostly due to how much the average gamer really loved the Call of Duty franchise and the way it blended the already existing modern military shooter formula with Hollywood blockbuster action. Everyone wanted a piece of that sweet, sweet billion-dollar pie, and Bandai Namco Games were no exception. They already had a modern military shooter, albeit set in the skies rather than on the ground, so now all that they needed to do was add in that Hollywood action and they would have a formula for success, right? Right? Well, you probably don't need me to tell you, but Assault Horizon would go on to be the most reviled entry in the franchise by the vast majority of the Ace Combat fandom, so it didn't quite work out as well as they might have hoped. But now, 13 years have passed since the game's initial release, and I've been playing every single Ace Combat game in release order for the first time in an attempt to not only finally experience them for myself, but also to give the longtime fans out there the perspective of a first-time player. So, is Ace Combat Assault Horizon really the worst entry in the franchise, or was it simply a knee-jerk reaction from fans not wanting the series to move further in this direction? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 11th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Ace Combat game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them, so I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Ace Combat Assault Horizon is a spin-off installment of the Ace Combat franchise developed by Project Aces and released by Bandai Namco Games for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in 2011. And right off the bat, let's cover which version of this game I played. I just mentioned that it came out for the PS3 and the Xbox 360 when it was originally released, but a couple years later, it was also released natively on PC for the first time in Ace Combat's history. This means that for me, it was way more convenient to get high quality footage for this video, as I didn't need to mess around with an emulator to upscale it and get nice frame rates and such, but there was a catch of course. See, the game was delisted from Steam back in 2019, meaning there's no official way to purchase the game anymore. Luckily though, there are still some keys floating around for it, so I was able to pick up a Steam copy for myself for $55. So you should all thank the patrons and channel members for their contributions, as they allow me to do things like spend nearly full price on a 13-year-old game that people don't even like. And I'm sure some of them are now questioning their decision to contribute in the first place. It was well worth it though, as this version of the game runs natively in 4K with an uncapped frame rate, and for me personally, had no issues or bugs outside of one crash when I first tried to launch the game, which was easily fixed by just running the game in compatibility mode for Windows 8. So shockingly, this port that's more than a decade old and hasn't been supported for years actually runs amazingly well on modern PCs with one really simple fix. A very pleasant surprise for me, as I had expected that it would take a ton of effort to get this thing working properly, but it basically worked right out of the box. But finally getting into the game itself, we're immediately thrown into a dogfight over Miami Beach. Much like Joint Assault, Assault Horizon is once again set in the real world rather than Strange Real. And so just like in that game, you'll be visiting a variety of real locations and seeing a number of real world cities and landmarks. And after having played through another Ace Combat game set in the real world, my opinion on the matter remains the same. I just really like seeing places that I already know and recognize as the backdrop of these epic dogfights. And in this game specifically, places that I've actually been to before as well. I really loved seeing Miami in the opening mission, as I just so happen to be a former Florida man myself, even if I personally think that Miami is the shittiest major city in the state. No offense, Miamians, Orlando is not far behind. Also, right off the bat, we get introduced to one of the new mechanics that Assault Horizon introduces, and from what I've seen, probably the most controversial of them as well. The DFM, or dogfight mode mechanic. If you approach an enemy's plane from behind and press both shoulder buttons on the controller, you enter into dogfight mode, which essentially acts as a soft lock-on to target the enemy with. Your plane will automatically maneuver to stay behind the enemy you've locked onto, and you'll be able to fire your machine guns and missiles while chasing them very easily when using this. There will also be this large circle on your screen, and as you hold an enemy inside of the circle, it will fill up to give you a super high accuracy lock for your missiles, giving you one missile shot that's basically guaranteed. This is a pretty fun mechanic, and the camera angles that you get while using it, along with all the effects from the enemy plane as you tear them up, look amazing, but there is a big issue with it. With a mechanic like this that gives you basically guaranteed missile shots, super easy machine gun tracking, and that just generally looks really cool, why would you ever not use this? Something that I haven't even brought up yet is that the pace of the gameplay in Assault Horizon is way faster than any previous Ace Combat game, so hitting enemies with missiles without using dogfight mode is harder than it ever was in the games that came before. There's a big issue here with DFM being the clear dominant strategy if you want to shoot down your targets quickly, which could be a relatively small issue, but there's a much worse problem here. While dogfight mode is really fun at first, after you've played the game for a couple hours, you'll more than likely be pretty sick of it, as almost every dogfight feels like it plays out the exact same way. And while I'm not going to hold it against the mechanic itself, there was one time that I was tracking an enemy with DFM and they just flew straight into the ground, and since I was locked onto them, my plane went straight down with them. This is definitely a symptom of the AI and not the mechanic itself, but it was just way too funny not to show you guys. Along with this, they've also added an equivalent for the air-to-ground combat called ASM or airstrike mode. With this though, instead of being able to use it freely whenever you want, a highlighted path will appear at certain points in certain missions that give you a path to fly down and clear out clusters of ground targets with. I actually feel like this works a lot better than dogfight mode, despite being basically the same thing, as air-to-ground missions in the Ace Combat series have a tendency to just go on for way longer than they have any reason to, so the game giving you the option to fly by and quickly clear out large clusters of targets actually improves the gameplay pacing during these missions. There's also one mission in the game that requires you to fly a bomber and take out ground targets, and this got its own unique version of DFM or ASM that's only used once, where you get to fly over the targets and select where to drop the bombs while the plane automatically navigates for you, and I actually enjoyed this one quite a bit too. I've always felt like lobbing bombs in the Ace Combat games was a little awkward to get used to, and while this simplifies the bombing gameplay by quite a bit, I think it's a simplification that just makes the process more enjoyable. On top of that, you get these cinematic shots of your bombs actually flying down and leveling everything after you release them, which is incredibly satisfying as typically in these games, you've flown past and missed the explosion by the time that the bombs actually land. And even if you don't like this particular change, it's only used once in the entire game, so it's not something that's going to have a massive impact on your enjoyment by any means. And speaking of how cool a lot of these things look, the presentation in this game is great. It reuses a lot of assets from Ace Combat 6, which I already thought looked really great back then, but now being able to see them in such a higher native resolution, they look so much better than I ever thought they did here. And as much as the cinematic heavy style of this game is a turnoff for people, mostly due to the effects that it has on the gameplay, the cinematography and all the effects from explosions to the shrapnel flying off enemy planes while you shoot them, and even the oil that leaks out of them look really damn good. The environments here have also been improved from Ace Combat 6, likely from Project Aces being more familiar with the hardware they were working on, and knowing how to squeeze some extra fidelity out of it without sacrificing the game's performance. Obviously, the visual fidelity of this game is going to vary a lot depending on which version you play, so if you've played the game yourself, just keep in mind that the PS3 got the worst of it, the 360 is in the middle, and the PC version is the one that actually looks really good. Along with that, this is still an Ace Combat game, so of course, the soundtrack here is still fantastic. It features a lot of that now iconic orchestral style that the games picked up back in the PS2 era, as well as the return of that rock sound that the original titles had way back on the PS1. But here, rather than sticking with a more upbeat rock sound, they've shifted to a much more aggressive, borderline metal sound that's honestly really fitting for the general tone this game is going for. It's a really good soundtrack, and I'm honestly surprised that I didn't hear more about it before playing for myself. Here, take a listen and see what you think. Back to the gameplay though, something that I left out when talking about dogfight mode earlier is that enemies also have access to this new mechanic. When an enemy uses it to lock onto you, you'll be able to see where their enhanced missile lock circle is, giving you the opportunity to avoid it. There's also an indicator of the distance the enemy has to you, which becomes vital in some cases to get a reversal on the enemy. Have you ever played the older Ace Combat games and had the enemies flip a 180 on you to suddenly gain the advantage and thought, well, that's just unfair, I can't do that shit? Well, now you can. If you let the enemy get in close, you can pull off a reversal to turn the tables of the engagement, positioning yourself behind them and automatically putting you into dogfight mode. It's a little awkward to get used to evading enemies like this because of how different it is from the previous games, but once you get into the flow of it, I think this is actually my favorite change to Assault Horizon's core gameplay. The reversals not only look really cool, but they also allow for much more aggressive play, and the risk-reward element to letting the enemy get so close to you balances out the feature pretty well. Another method of evasion has been added here though, with flares being included for the first time in the Ace Combat series. If a missile is coming at you and you don't want to or can't evade away, you can click in the left thumbstick to deploy flares, but these aren't exactly a get out of jail free card. For the flares to actually prevent you from taking a hit, you'll have to deploy them just before the missile actually hits you, meaning that you'll still have to divert your focus to negating the missile in order to avoid it successfully. You only get a handful of flares to use per mission as well, so you'll have to be pretty careful with when you use them, otherwise you'll find yourself running out pretty quickly. It's not a game-changing addition by any means, but it's really nice to have them here, and I'm kind of surprised that it took this long for them to get added. One thing that got added to Assault Horizon that didn't really need to be here though was QuickTime events. These were obviously added because they were trending in the industry at the time, but all that Project Aces ended up doing with them here was having you occasionally press the Y button on your controller to either progress a cutscene or focus the camera on something in the level. I would say that these are a negative addition, but they aren't actually integrated into the gameplay really at all. Every once in a while, one of these will pop up just to focus the camera on something cool, and you'll go, oh yeah, they added those. So ultimately, it's just a bit of a pointless addition that doesn't really add to or take away from the gameplay. And this next change is definitely the one that I would have thought would be the most controversial, but shockingly, I never heard about it a single time before playing the game for myself. Rather than using the traditional damage system that Ace Combat has used up to this point, where you'll be able to take a certain amount of damage per mission before ultimately being shot down, this game has regenerating health. Yeah, if you get hit by a missile, you'll take a good chunk of damage, and you'll even be able to see that damage reflected on your plane model, but then if you go like 10 seconds without taking any damage, that damage to your plane will just slowly regenerate. This was very off-putting to me at first, but to be completely fair to Project Aces, it doesn't actually break the balance or the difficulty of the game. I've managed to get through a handful of my first playthroughs of the Ace Combat games while only getting shot down once or twice during my entire run, and while Assault Horizon isn't the game I got shot down the most during, it's definitely somewhere near the middle of the road difficulty-wise. It's certainly not as challenging as the PSP titles, but it's definitely much more difficult than games like AC2 or AC4. I think the most comparable game in terms of difficulty is probably Ace Combat 5, which is shocking considering the addition of regenerating health here. Even though your health comes back after a few seconds, this is a much faster and more aggressive game, and even on normal difficulty, you'll have a number of moments where you go from full health to dead in a matter of seconds due to just how much enemy fire you're actually taking. This might be why I've never heard people complain about it before, and while I think the gameplay balance manages to be perfectly fine with it, I'm not really sure why they would go to the lengths of reflecting the damage taken in your plane model in a game where it will just magically go away in a matter of seconds, as it's really jarring whenever that happens. Circling back to that opening Miami mission though, we get hit by a missile head on, disabling our plane and forcing our pilot Bishop to eject. He gets himself out and pulls his chute, but as he's floating to the ground, an enemy jet flies up and hits him head on, causing him to wake up, revealing that this opening Miami level was just a nightmare of his, and that he seems to be suffering from some sort of PTSD, having these nightmares where he dies in flight regularly. From here, we get the basic setup for the story, with the American and Russian militaries working together to fight against insurgents in East Africa. The story here is so unapologetically rule of cool, but I'd be lying if I told you that I didn't find myself smiling at the characters from time to time.
Now we owe you more drinks, eh?
Yeah, you can pay me off anytime.
No. There is not enough vodka in all Russia for you, Capitan Gutierrez.
We'll talk more about the story later on in the video, but for now, just know that if you've ever played a COD campaign post COD 4, that's exactly how the storytelling in this game feels. We then cut to another character on a mission in Africa, where instead of flying a jet, we're taking control of a chopper gunner. Again, if you've played a Call of Duty game that has a chopper gunner segment before, you know exactly how this plays out. During these missions, the game basically becomes an on-rail shooter where we simply need to shoot at targets on the ground while the pilot flies the helicopter around for us. This is the first of 2 chopper gunner missions that appear in the game's campaign, and while there's not enough going on here to keep this interesting for long periods of time, it's still pretty enjoyable to just tear shit up with a minigun for 5 to 10 minutes, even if that's not exactly what I'm playing Ace Combat for. After this though, we get back to flying some planes, and now that we're not in a dream, we get to see the hangar for the first time in the game. Right off the bat, there are 5 planes available to us, and this brings us straight into a big change with the core progression of the game here. Instead of earning credits during missions to purchase new planes while you play, players are simply given access to planes at certain points in the story, just being able to fly them for free as soon as they unlock. This is similar to what they did back in Ace Combat 3, but in that game, you would only have like 2 to 4 planes available at any given time due to how the factions worked in that game, whereas here, you just slowly build up the full collection like in more traditional Ace Combat games. It's not something that really affects the game all that much, but it's a significant enough change that I felt like it was important to mention it. And after getting some more time in with Bishop, we once again switch over to a different character, this time to fly an Apache attack helicopter. When controlling the Apache, you can use the left stick to move around, there are dedicated buttons to move your altitude up or down, and you can use the chopper's machine gun as well as whatever special weapons you equipped before the mission began. Much like the chopper gunner missions, these are incredibly simple, but can definitely be a fun distraction for a few minutes. Unlike the chopper gunner missions though, these are about as long as your average Ace Combat missions, being closer to 15 to 20 minutes in length, and I found that while I always had fun at the start, I was normally pretty bored and ready to move on by the end. Like I said, they aren't bad as a small distraction, but I feel like these definitely outstay their welcome. And immediately after we're introduced to the Apache missions, we also get a mission where we sit in the gunner seat of an AC-130. I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, but if you've ever played a Call of Duty campaign that features one of these missions, you know exactly how this works. You've got 3 different weapons to fire, ranging from large explosives to smaller explosives to a minigun for cleaning up infantry, all of which are cycled through with the press of a button. This mission goes on for about 20 minutes, and at the risk of repeating myself yet again, it's fun for a few minutes, but it goes on for a little longer than it really should. So as a closing thought on all these new mission types, I think they're all perfectly fine in their own right, but they're just too simple to make up as much of the game's campaign as they do. See, Assault Horizon's campaign has a total of 16 missions, and 5 of them take place in either the Chopper Gunner, Apache, or AC-130. These missions are all fun little distractions, but they really shouldn't have made up a third of the game's total runtime, or if they were going to, they should have at least been fleshed out more to feel like proper Ace Combat missions rather than just fun little mini games. During these opening missions, we discover that the insurgents in Africa have a new type of conventional explosive that packs the raw power of a nuclear weapon. And once we're back in the sky with Bishop, half of the Russian forces that we're working with suddenly open fire on us, revealing that they've been helping the insurgents in order to get their hands on this new weapon that they call Trinity. And during this dogfight, we take a hit from a pilot named Andrei Markov, Russia's greatest ace, before he's ordered to withdraw along with his allies. So from here, the plot suddenly shifts from fighting insurgents in Africa to fighting a coup d'etat led by Russian mercenaries in order to prevent them from using the Trinity weapon on civilians. With this new direction, we start traveling all over the world, leading to some great variety in terms of locations, but the mission variety in this game is pretty lacking. Almost all of your missions will be basic air-to-air or air-to-ground missions, as things like the Chopper Gunner and Apache missions are essentially doing all the heavy lifting when it comes to the variety here. There is one particular mission that I found interesting that we'll come back to in a bit as it ties directly into the plot of the game, but aside from that, don't expect anything all that special as far as the missions go here. And not a whole lot really happens to further the plot until the start of the final act, but once you get there, there's a lot that happens all at once. To start with, remember this charismatic fella?
I'm sorry. It is personal. The women, you know?
The women or woman? You dog!
Well, this is Major Sergei Ilyich, one of the best aces of the Russian Air Force and one of Bishop's closest allies throughout the game. At the beginning of the third act, though, Ilyich suddenly disappears, and it's revealed that he and Markov, the ace who nearly shot us down earlier, have been very close friends for years, and that Ilyich was always secretly working with them. Along with this, it's revealed that Markov's wife was killed by an American bomber plane years ago, and we get a scene where he goes to the general who's leading the coup, shooting him multiple times and taking over as their leader. He changes the mercenaries' goal from taking over Russia to getting revenge on America, and so we get sent out to defend the city of Miami from an attack. And at first, I figured this was just the game coming full circle and ending in the same place it began, but it quickly became clear that I was playing the same mission from the game's opening nightmare. Bishop wasn't suffering from PTSD, he was somehow having visions of his own future, and many of the pursuits and scenarios that we get into here are almost exactly the same as what happened in the opening mission. But this time, just as Markov appears and is about to shoot us down, our wingman Guts pulls in from the side, taking the hit instead of us. His plane gets so messed up that he can't eject the canopy, so we have him flip upside down, and we get this really tense moment where we need to shoot the canopy off so that he can fall out, but without accidentally shooting him as well. We manage to do so, and with Guts safe, we go to pursue Markov, who has a Trinity missile loaded onto his jet. As we fly northeast, we end up finding Markov and Ilyich flying together through a hurricane, and while Markov continues to fly up the coast, Ilyich and the rest of the fighters nearby decide to handle us for him. So we end up getting into a dogfight with the best pilot in the game up to this point, with the catch being that we have to fight him in the middle of a goddamn hurricane, with the winds occasionally pulling or pushing us in random directions. This is the mission I alluded to earlier, as having an intense dogfight in severe weather conditions is something that the series has never done before, and I'm shocked that they didn't do so sooner as it's such an intense gimmick. We eventually shoot him down, following Markov further up the coast, eventually finding him in Washington, D.C. He decides that he wants to shoot us down before launching his Trinity missile at the White House, and we get one of the craziest dogfights of the entire series so far. We're constantly entering dogfight mode and getting these crazy cinematic flights through buildings and just over the river, and Markov is constantly getting on our tail and forcing us to evade as well. And it showed me that even with dogfight mode being added, ace pilots can still be a serious challenge in this game. It took me like 30 minutes of trying this fight over and over again to eventually shoot him down, but when we do, it turns out that he had already released the Trinity missile, so we end up shooting it before it can reach the ground as well, and then it's all over. We get an appropriately cheesy ending for the tone of the story, and the credits roll. Overall, I like some of the ideas present in Assault Horizon, but I can definitely see why people don't like this one. For every good step forward it takes, it feels like it takes 2 steps back. I think that the rule of cool tone that it goes for is pretty entertaining and a breath of fresh air considering how tonally similar a lot of these games tend to be. It's not as elegant or replayable as the other Ace Combat games, but it is a really fun action game to just sit down and blow off some steam with. And I can totally understand why the fandom hated this game so much, as my favorite gaming franchise of all time is Resident Evil, and I ended up going through the exact same thing just a year later. Much like Resident Evil 6, I think that Assault Horizon would have been a terrible direction to take the series in as a whole, but now that we're more than a decade separated from it and the series has already course corrected, we can all look back at this as that one time that they made a big dumb action game and recognize that while it definitely has its problems, it can be some stupid fun every once in a while. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Ace Combat Assault Horizon a 6.8. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you want to check out more of my reviews, you can check them out right here, and if you want to see more stuff like this in the future, be sure to subscribe to the channel. I also want to thank the incredible people who support me on Patreon. You guys are the reason I'm able to do all this, and I can't thank you enough. Well guys, I'm going to get back to work, and I'll hope to catch all of you right here for the next Ace Combat review.